Welcome back, everyone. Today was round number 8 of the Tata Steel Masters, which is being played in Wijk aan Zee in the Netherlands. Now, as we know, Magnus Carlsen, the world champion, he's had a very up and down event. He lost a couple of games in a row in the middle of the event. Now, as we head towards the second half of the tournament, he won a big game yesterday, which we did cover on our channel here. And in round number 8, he was playing with the black pieces against the American number 1, currently ahead of yours truly, Hikaru, Fabiano Caruana. So Magnus, obviously the black pieces, wants to get on the board. Let's get going. So the game starts with e4. We get e5, knight to f3, knight to c6. We get bishop b5. Magnus plays a6. He does not play knight f6 in the Berlin defense. He tries to be a little bit more aggressive. So after a6, we get bishop to a4. Knight to f6 is played. Fabiano castles. Magnus plays bishop e7, rook e1, b5, bishop b3, castles. And here is the first critical point of the game. Fabiano chooses to play this move a4 on move number 8, which is an attempt to avoid the classic Marshall gambit. So in this position, the normal move that has been played over many years is c3. But after d5, pawn takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes pawn, knight takes, rook takes, c6, followed by bishop d6 and queen h4. This is what we call the Marshall gambit of the Spanish opening. And in general, it's considered to be pretty sound for black. I actually had this against Magnus Carlsen in the Speed Chess Championship a few times back in December. So Fabiano doesn't want to play this. Now, of course, if Fabiano was happy with a draw, he could have played something along these lines and probably just made a stable, steady draw. But Fabiano with the white pieces wants to go after Magnus. Magnus not having his best tournament. So it's a very logical decision to not do this. So Fabiano chooses to play a4 here. We get b4. And now Fabiano plays this move a5. Now, to give you guys a little bit of a history lesson, if you go back to a period around 2014, 2015, I actually played a lot of games in this anti-Marshall variation with a4, b4. I played d4 many times. I think I played a5 a few times. In general, d4 is considered to be the best move, but after d6, d takes e5, black can take with either the pawn or the knight, and there are many different variations, but in general, it's considered to be pretty steady for black. But I have had a lot of experience with this. I think d4 is the best move, but Fabiano chooses to play a5 here. So we get a5, d6 is played here, and now we get c3 played by Fabiano. We get rook to b8, and now he plays h3. Now this is a very logical move. It stops black from putting the bishop on g4. Additionally, with this pawn on c3, you still want to play for d4 to build a connect 4, as well as a big white center. So we get h3, h6, Fabiano plays d4, Magnus trades on c3, trades on d4, and here we get this move, knight takes d4. While it would be nice to capture the pawn on d4 here, one of the problems is that black can now play d5. If you play e5, knight to e4, black has this great knight on e4. This pawn on a5 is a little bit loose, and your bishop on b3 is a little bit weak because the rook on b8 has this open file. Now, if we compare variations, one of the things that's really important to note is the pawn structure and what are the differences. So one of the main lines in the Spanish that can occur here after c3 is black plays a move like d6. We get like h3. Let's just say h6, for example. White goes d4. Now, as you'll notice in such positions, white has the big white center here, but black does not have any real counterplay with an open b file. The structure is very solid here. You can't really trade off all the pawns right away. And if you take on d4, white takes back, and he gets these two pawns, which are very well placed. Additionally, if black plays d5 in a position like this, you can go e5, knight e4, and knight b to d2. And now white is just simply better here because if you trade, white just takes back. And if you play a move like bishop to f5, white can now go bishop c2, forcing some exchanges. So if we compare this with what happens in the game, as we go forward, you'll notice that here after takes, if you take with the pawn, let's just say d5, e5, knight e4, knight b d2, try and play something along the same lines. If you go bishop f5 here, you cannot play bishop c2 because spaghetti-o, I have knight to c3, and now I will win your queen on d1. It is completely trapped. Whereas in the other variation, you had a pawn on b2. So these little differences do matter a lot in certain openings like the Spanish, where a lot of it is about the pawn structure and the specific piece placement. So because of that, Fabiano chooses here to capture with the knight on d4. We get bishop to d7 being played by Magnus. He does not want to trade the knights here because now if you trade and play d5, for example here, white can actually take the pawn. You cannot capture back because after the trade on d5, you lose the bishop on e7. So now if you play like bishop b7, knight to c3, you can play bishop b4, and the show goes on. White is probably a little bit better here, but again, at the end of the day, it is a position. So Magnus here obviously understands what's going on. He's very well prepared, by the way. It seems like he was playing relatively quickly. He plays bishop to d7. Now Fabiano plays bishop to f4 here, trying to finish his development. Again, the one problem white has is these three pieces on c1, b1, and a1. They are not developed. They're not in the game. And as we always tell beginners, develop your pieces. So Fabiano plays bishop f4, also a very logical move, because if you think about this bishop here, yes, it's on this diagonal targeting potentially something like the pawn on h6 down the road, but once you put the bishop on f4, you have long-term ideas like, let me just make some random moves, where you can maybe play e5 takes and get a wooden shield, and now the bishop has multiple diagonals to attack on. So bishop f4 is a very logical move from Fabiano, because he doesn't just want to use this one diagonal, he wants to potentially use this other diagonal from f4 to b8. So we get knight to e5 from Magnus, basically preventing the trade, preventing the pawn push, and now the bishop on f4, it looks nice, but you can't really do anything on this diagonal because there are 4 pieces in the way. We get knight to a3 here. And now it's worth noting here, computer actually thinks after bishop g3, white is probably a little bit better, but it gets very sharp for a couple of reasons. First of all, black can play g6 to prevent knight to f5, followed by a c5. Black can even maybe go c5 right away here. And after knight to f5, for example, black can play c4, bishop c2, bishop takes f5, e takes f5, and queen c7. And it's very, very hard to judge what is going on here, because black can play rook b5 and go after this weak pawn on a5. There are also ideas like knight d3 to trade the bishop for the knight. And overall, position is probably balanced. So Fabiano is not a computer, as we know, and he chooses to play knight to a3 instead. We get rook to e8 here by Magnus. Idea to maybe go bishop f8, maybe a long-term idea, like just to illustrate it, to play knight to g6, attacking the bishop, and then winning the pawn on e4 here. So we get bishop to g3 now. Magnus goes bishop f8. We get f4, knight back to c6, and now this e4 pawn is definitely weak. So Fabiano plays e5, we get takes, Magnus trades on d4, and here he finds a very, very nice move, which is this move bishop to c6. Now, on first glance, someone's probably like, wait, what? As I would do myself when I play this, I'm like, what is that? What's going on? You like bishop c6, like white can obviously just grab the free knight, right, on f6. However, white cannot do this, because after rook takes e1, well, white could play it, obviously, but after rook takes rook, bishop takes rook, black can now go rook takes bishop on b3, and the material is even. Black has 2 bishops, white is the bishop and knight, but the problem is now your knight's under attack on a3 from the rook and the bishop, and if you capture the rook, now I play queen takes pawn check. We have a classic double attack, or a pyramid of Giza, with this queen on d4. Black's going to win the rook on a1, and black is completely winning. So you can't really take the knight, and Fabiano here spends a lot of time. I suspect that he was a little bit confused by what was going on here, because on first glance, in this position after c takes d4, it looks really, really promising for white. If black were to say move the knight back to h7, for example, in this position, white can play a move like rook to f1. There's a lot of pressure on this f7 pawn, maybe even a move like d5 to go e6 later on. White is taking a lot of space in the center of the board, and it's really, really pleasant. So bishop c6 is a fantastic move by Magnus, and at this point, Fabiano completely loses control of the game, and he plays this move bishop c2, which is an epic fail. Now, it's already hard because, like I said, Fabiano probably thought that after he took with the pawn on d4, he's feeling pretty good, thought he should be a little bit better, and then suddenly after bishop c6, you're like, wait a second, what's going on? Because again, you have this bishop on g3, which is behind a pawn on e5. So from a fundamental standpoint, if white cannot push e6 and open up this diagonal, the bishop is just sitting behind this pawn and doesn't really have any scope. Additionally, this bishop on b3 on first glance looks really good because it's targeting this pawn on f7 and the king on g8. But if black can just say, let me make some random moves, black can blockade here. Both these bishops are really, really poorly placed. This bishop on g3 is behind the pawn. This bishop on b3 is stuck because there's this knight on d5 in the way. So both bishops aren't really all that well placed. Additionally, your knight on a3 is a little bit misplaced as well. And the rook on b8 always puts pressure on the bishop on b3. So all three of these minor pieces are not very well placed. And it's very easy to be like, wait, what's going on? Suddenly I thought I was better and now I'm not. And Fabiano does not respond the correct way. He plays this move bishop to c2 here. So after playing this move, bishop to c2, which is a big blunder, Magnus shows no mercy. He plays queen to d5, lining up with what we call the classic double-A battery, threatening checkmate on g2. Magnus has a lot of threats here. White cannot go bishop to e4, for example, because if knight takes bishop. So you have to try to guard against a checkmate with a queen move or a rook move. If you go queen d2, you run into bishop b4, which wins either the queen on d2 or the rook on e1. If you go queen to e2, I gobble on d4, and after bishop to f2, attacking the queen, I simply move my queen back to d5, resetting the double-A battery. So you can't really move the queen to either e2 or d2. If you go to f3, also I just take on d4. So the only other way to stop the checkmate on g2 is to play rook to e2. Now here, it might look like for a second you're okay. The knight's under attack. You can maybe go queen d3 to line up your own double-A battery. But Magnus again plays the absolute best move, which is this move rook to b4, attacking the pawn on d4 with the queen and the rook. Now again, the problem for white here is that if you capture the juicer on f6, I trade the rooks on e2, and after queen takes pawn check, again you can move the king, but after queen takes rook, if you go queen d3, lining up the checkmate again, I simply can play g6 here, stopping the mate, and with the extra rook for the bishop, for the knight, this should be a pretty straightforward win. So white can't really take the knight on f6, but also how does white guard the pawn on d4? Because again, you can't move the bishop to either e4 or b3, both the squares are covered. If you play a move like bishop f2 to guard d4, then it's checkmate on g2. And if you play rook to d2 to guard the pawn, I can play this crushing move, rook takes d4, because again, you can't recapture the rook because of checkmate. And if you go bishop to e1, for example, I can even play a move like bishop to b4, and it's just simply overwhelming here. There's the pin, there's the checkmate, it's just game over. So here, Fabiano plays this move king to h2, just trying to move the king out of the way and maybe create some counterplay down the road. Magnus plays rook takes pawn, we get queen to b1, and here Magnus plays knight e4. Now this is not the quickest way to win or the absolute best move, but one thing that's really important to note at the top level of chess is sometimes you want to simplify the position to an endgame where you know you're going to win, like 99% of the time, versus potentially missing a one move tactic. Because in this position, the correct move that the computer likes and wins on the spot is rook to d2. But after rook takes rook, queen takes rook, queen to f1, stopping the checkmate on g2. Black can go knight h5 here. But again, on first glance, you see that there's this move bishop to b3, lining up this big attack towards the pawn on f7. Now the computer, of course, see no fear, hear no evil, whatever that saying is, basically just says take the bishop on g3, no worries, you're completely winning. Now for a human, you would have to calculate this, and granted, this is winning for black after queen takes pawn, king h7, queen g8, king g6, queen f7, and king g5. But again, you're taking the king on a little bit of a walk, and you do sometimes worry that you could overlook a one move tactic. So because of this, Magnus does not play rook d2. Instead, he plays knight to e4. And the problem with this for Fabiano is that now he has to trade off everything. If you don't trade off on e4, I will take the bishop and win the pawn on e5. So just to illustrate, say queen b2, takes, rook takes e5. This is just simply game over. The double op combo is going to play, and your king is super open. So this would be winning for black. So you don't really want to trade, but you have to. And the reason this is so sad to have to do is because now we reach this endgame where black has an extra pawn on c7, but more importantly, he's the two bishops, or the bishop pair, as we like to say in chess terms. And additionally, Fabiano has two additional weak pawns on e5 and a5. This dark square bishop can go after both of them. So at this point, it's already lost for Fabiano, but as we know, Fabiano is a great defender, and he tries to play on. We get knight to c4 here. Rook to b8 is played by Magnus. We get rook to c1, trying to do something on the c file. Rook to b5 is played here, attacking the pawn on a5. Also, rook c5 ideas exist, so it's just simply too much. Fabiano plays e6. We get pawn takes pawn, bishop takes c7, and now Magnus plays rook to c5, attacking the bishop on c7. And Fabiano very sagely has to go bishop to f4. If you were to play bishop b6, I can very simply go rook to c6 here. And this pin is a huge problem. You cannot move the rook away because after rook takes knight, I guard the bishop on e4. And here you kind of have to go bishop e3. If you play something like king g3, I just go bishop d5, and you will lose either the knight on c4 or the rook all the way down on c1. So Fabiano goes bishop f4 to try to guard the rook here on c1, and now Magnus plays bishop d5, and here Fabiano resigns the game on move number 33. Now, what can we say about this game? There are a couple things that need to be said, and I'm going to say this, again, people can take this however they want to take it, but what world do we live in? It is the year 2023. If I were to go back, let's say 4 years to maybe 2019, the common knock on a certain Hikaru Nakamura was that whenever he played against Magnus Carlsen, Magnus was in his mind, he did terribly. Whereas a player like Fabiano, on the other hand, did great against Magnus, came very close to beating him in the World Championship, and simply had no mental block. Now, the reason I say this is because it's very apparent to me as I look at these games that ever since Fabiano lost to Magnus by the score of 22-4 in the Speed Chess Championship, where Magnus lost a whopping 0 games, Fabiano is simply unable to play against Magnus. Magnus has completely gotten into his head, and Fabiano fell apart against him in the World Blitz and Rapid Championship. He fell apart against him here in Tata Steel, and it's just, I don't know what Fabiano needs to change, but it's very clear that at the moment, Magnus is totally inside of his head, and mentally Fabiano cannot play against Magnus. So it's very surprising to see. As I said, if I go back a few years, I never in a million years would have thought that Fabiano could lose to Magnus like this, but times change, the world changed, and this is the timeline that we live in. So at any rate, Magnus wins his second game in a row with the black pieces. I believe that tomorrow is a rest day if I'm not mistaken, but Magnus wins his second game in a row. He wins with the black pieces, so he's now on a +1 score. Barring anything crazy happening, he is only 1.5 points out of first place, and there are still 7 more rounds to go, or are there 5 more rounds to go? I'm not sure how many more rounds there are. This is round number 8, right? It's 13. So there are 5 more rounds to go, so anything could happen. Magnus could get red hot. He could win. He obviously has to play against a bunch of the juniors to close out the event. So it's going to be really exciting to see what happens down the road. At any rate, you guys, I hope you have enjoyed this recap. Once again, sorry for the hoodie. I was just outside. It was very cold. And obviously, I'm on the road, so I'm in California. So at any rate, hope you guys enjoyed the recap. And make sure to hit that subscribe button below if you haven't. And I will be back with more recaps very soon. Nothing but peace and love to all of y'all on YouTube. See you guys soon. Have a good one. Bye.